Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Little Ghost Stories, Volume 2, Story Number 1. What happened to me and my fellow campers was pretty frightening. It happened late at night when all the kids were in their cabins close to sleep. It could have been in the middle of the night, but all I remember was waking up to someone entering the cabin very quietly. Whatever it was that came in walked really weird. I didn't see it walking, but I heard the way it slid its feet across the floor. Not a step at a time, but dragging each foot with some effort, like it had a limp or something. It closed in on our side of the cabin, and to this day I could still remember the way it breathed, very labored, cold, and gurgling. It walked into our room and stood there, reading right by my bed. I was on the top bunk, so it was pretty much eye level with me if I were to turn around, but I didn't. I was scared to death and hid under my covers. It just stood there, paced and breathed for about a half hour. It seemed like it was there forever. When I woke in the morning, I asked all the counselors who had been in the cabin, and they were dumbfounded. They did not have a clue. I started asking my fellow campers if they had seen anything. They all told me they heard this guy breathing really weird, and they were scared also. One camper in particular had a glimpse of this thing. All they saw was a shadow, but its profile was very lean and hunched over. But what was really disturbing was that it paced back and forth at a manic speed. Like if you were to record something and play it in fast forward, it also reached out while it stumbled back and forth unnaturally too fast. To this day, I still think about that night at camp. Story number 2. It started out as a joke. My boyfriend and I were going to hide at this house that was supposedly haunted. I thought the stories were just told to scare little kids. My friend dropped us off, and almost immediately I started feeling bad, like something was wrong. We started to walk away from the house toward the creek when I looked back and saw a black image following us from behind, about 30 yards back. I barely caught a glimpse when it darted off into the bushes. After reaching the creek, I kept seeing a light up at this house. It was like a very big light that was slowly flashing. I've always been told that spirits can't cross water, but I don't believe that. I was standing along the creek in my boyfriend's arms when I saw something, a dark image standing across the creek in the bushes. It stood about 6 feet 5 inches. I tried not to look because it scared me, but I continued to stare at it. I couldn't seem to take my eyes off of it. As I was watching, I saw something spread apart the bushes and walk towards me through the water. I couldn't see it, but I could tell it was moving toward me. It was partially invisible. I saw the footsteps in the water coming at me. I was scared to death, but I couldn't say anything. It stopped in the water halfway to me and stayed there for a few minutes. Then it turned around and walked back out of the water and up through the bushes. Finally, my friend showed up with the girls we were supposed to scare, so we started making our way back across the creek. When I looked across the creek, the black image was no longer there. When I reached the car and got in, I felt safe, but still not secure. I truly believe in what I saw, and I refused to go there again. I was told that I have a wall of angels around me, and I believe that is the only thing that saved me that night from being harmed. Next story. I'm not a crazy, and I don't see stuff like this all the time, nor do I hear voices. I come from a small county full of small towns, and most of the other surrounding counties are the same. Around here, there isn't much to do besides go out in the boondocks, the middle of nowhere, and shoot guns, drink beer, fish, or have a small party. When I was in school, there was a few spots we would go to hang out at. The one I'm referring to here is called the Lost City. The reason it's called that is because it's what's left of an oil refinery that exploded over 20 years ago, and the area kind of looks like a city. It was left alone and never torn down, and the woods grew up around it. We loved to hang out there because there were lots of places to climb up on, tons of concrete to tag, and it was big enough that if you wanted to get some privacy, you could. We had a lot of parties out there. Well, three of us broke the habit of going out there by the events of one night. Myself and two friends, Greg and Justin, went out there to hang out and see if anyone else showed up. We were sitting in the car talking when Justin told us to hush. He said he heard someone talking in the woods. So Greg and I shut up and listened, but didn't hear anything. We started talking again, and we're trying to decide what to do, where to go, when we all started to hear the voices. It was not exactly talking, more like mumbling and hissing sounds. We were sort of spooked, but I thought it was just someone messing with us. Greg and Justin agreed. We got out of the car and started walking around acting like we were tough guys. We yelled and cursed and said it would take more than that to scare us, and that we knew they were out there. The voices didn't stop, and we didn't stop either. We were walking slowly towards the woods. I was holding my tire iron and Greg some sticks when we saw something move. He stopped and said, "Shh." He pointed out to where he saw the movement, and we watched the tree line for more. We could still hear the sound and still thought it was friends of ours. While we were watching, we started to see shadows moving around in the tree line. Justin told me to go turn the light in the car on so we could see them, so I walked back to the car and hit the headlights. When I did, we saw nothing, and the sound stopped. That event scared us, but we were still saying that it was somebody and not something. We decided that it might not be someone we know, and that maybe we should go. So we all got in the car, and as I started to turn around, the sound started back up again. The noises were not any louder than the first time, but we could see people moving all around in the woods and in the grass. At this point, we were scared to death, and I was doing my best to get that car turned around. The lights hit one of the figures, and as it did, the figure was gone. It was like they were there, but not there. I hit the brakes thinking I was going to run over someone, but there was no one in front of the car. Now we could see large black forms moving along the tree line and moving out into the opening towards us. They were like shadows, some big and some small. Some looked like people, and others more like animals or shapes. I could not move. I was so scared. I just sat there looking at the shadows as they moved about. I finally snapped out of it, and we got the hell out of there, and haven't been back since. I don't think any of us ever wanted to go back. We told a few people, and I have been told similar stories of what people around here call the shadow people. Next story. I live in the Ocean Parkway section of Brooklyn in New York City. When I was 15 years old, I was living in a house not far away from where I live now. My friend Rob asked me to come visit him after school one day. It had been raining the whole day, so I decided to wait until the rain stopped before I went to his house. The rain stopped around 5 p.m., and I thought it was kind of late, so I called him and told him I decided not to go. For some reason, he was insistent because he bought some $1,000 bike and wanted me to see it. I got there around 8:30 p.m. because I had to eat dinner and do my homework. As I was walking towards his stoop, I stopped, hearing the cars passing by and all the city confusion. Everything was quiet, very unusual for Brooklyn, a place where 2 million people live, but I figured that it was nothing. As I got closer to the house, there was an odd wind that flew by me, but I didn't hear its wake. I just felt like a chilling cold sensation. Then suddenly I saw a man who looked gray and gloomy, smoking a guinea stinker. That is a Brooklyn word for an old Italian man's cigar. Without any smoke. I thought maybe it was one of Rob's father's friends, but I knew that was wrong when I was about to get on the stoop. The old man got up, opened the front door with his stinker still in his mouth, and he disappeared. Even though the door was open, he still kind of passed through it. I went into the house and asked Rob who the man was, but Rob looked at me like I was a moron and told me to stop messing around. But his mother, who was always on edge about something, had a smile on her face. She pulled me aside when Rob went to the bathroom and said that the figure was evil, and his vision had been tormenting her since she bought the house 17 years before. Maybe he had lived in the house previously and died there. I don't know. I never saw the man again, and Rob moved to Queens because his dad opened a bakery in the Bronx and wanted a closer commute. Since then, I never went to that house, and I have no reason to. I wonder what the people who bought it would have to say, though. Next story. I'm an average sensible woman who had an extraordinary experience. It happened when I was about to turn 5 years old, and it happened more than once. My younger sister and I shared a twin bed. I was 4 and she was 3 at the time. My 2 older sisters shared a double bed along the same wall. Nestled between the 2 beds was a typical brown wood 6-drawer chest of drawers. One night, I woke because I needed to use the bathroom. I vividly remember sliding down off the bed in my pajamas with the feet, with a chest of drawers at my right. It was taller than I was. All of a sudden, a white, see-through hand silently emerged out of the 5th drawer and enclosed my right wrist. I was surprised and shocked, but I wasn't frightened at the time. I simply knew that I needed to get back in bed. The hand withdrew. I felt kind of like I was in shock. I gazed out the window at the foot of my sister's bed, and I heard a sound that I can't describe, kind of like I was underwater. Then I got back up on the bed and fell asleep. Of course, I wet the bed. My mom was not happy. My sisters became frightened in the morning when I looked in the drawer and I told them what I was looking for. That I was looking for a hand. And that they thought I was making up the story to cover for wetting the bed, which made me mad because I was a big girl and I didn't fib. But really, I was more frightened of the hand, so I began sleeping at the foot of the bed so it couldn't get me. Of course, I stopped wetting the bed. The best part of the story, though, is that my dad believed me. He went out and borrowed a dresser from his mom and put the brown one on the back porch. That night, I was drawn out onto the porch. I remember it vividly. The moon was shining bright, and I just stood back and stared at it. I knew it could never get me again. Some people may find this hard to believe because of my age or because of a child's tendency to fib, to protect themselves. But I have to tell you, when something like this happens to you, time stops. You become completely conscious of every detail. It becomes burned into your memory permanently. I don't share this with normal people anymore. It feels horrible when they look at you like you're insane, which I'm not. Next story. It all started when I was about 10 years old. It was 1975. We had moved into a house that was built in 1910 and had its share of strange encounters. The people that had lived there before us were a middle-aged couple. The man had gone crazy and killed his wife. He was then committed to a state-run hospital. I don't know the name of the hospital, but like I said, I was about 10 years old then and didn't ask the neighbors what the name was. We moved into the house, and by the time we were done on moving in day, it was late, and my bedtime, so I went to bed. I was lying in bed and had my clothes next to the bed in a large black plastic bag. I lay there and all of a sudden something hit both the bags at the same time. I called to my mom and told her that we had rats, because something just jumped on the bags. When whatever had hit the bags, I was looking in that direction but hadn't seen anything. It didn't dawn on me that it could be ghosts. My mother said, "No, we don't have rats. Go to sleep." And that's what I did. A couple of days passed, and that night, the water in the bathroom connecting my room to my mother's room came on in the middle of the night, so I got up and turned it off. The next morning, I asked my mom why she left the water running in the bathroom. She said she hadn't, but maybe Bobby had. Bobby was her husband. He drank a lot, and sometimes passed out from drinking too much. After that night, we had a few things happen, like lights going off and on. Mom's excuse? I shortened the wires that go to the light. I sometimes had to go into the basement where there was one light, a bulb hanging from the ceiling, and 3 rooms with no light. Not a great feeling when you go down there. I always got goosebumps and had a feeling of someone looking at me. Well, things with Mom and Bobby's relationship were not good at all, and we had to leave because of it. After we had left the Hat House, my mom told me that she had often heard someone calling her name from the basement when she was there alone. I'd never heard anyone speaking, or if I did, I thought it was Mom and Bobby. I never thought that there were ghosts hitting my trash bags with clothes in it until years later. We never found any rats, mice, or rodents in the house. The neighbors would say before we moved in to the house that they used to hear noises coming from the house, that it sounded like people walking on the front porch and people in the backyard. It was weird. I will never forget that house, mainly because of the way I felt there or the way the house made me feel. Next story. A friend and I had an unusual experience in 1997 that I thought you might find interesting. It was August, and my friend Larry and I got together on a Wednesday afternoon for a game of tennis. We were driving through North Cambridge, Massachusetts, and didn't know where the nearest tennis courts were. I pulled up to a cop on a side street off Route 2 and asked him where the nearest tennis courts were. Although neither of us said anything at the time, we both thought there was something weird about the cop. I'm not sure if it was the way he was dressed or his attitude. He seemed to have an interest in my car. In any case, he gave us clear directions to tennis courts about 2 blocks away. We followed his instructions, turned right into a driveway, and sure enough, there were 3 tennis courts right in front of us. We both looked at the courts very intently to see if any courts were available. They were all occupied. It struck us both as odd that all the players were dressed in white. We both took notice of a very attractive young lady in the right court wearing a short white tennis dress. She was preparing to address the serve. We decided to wait for a court to come free, and I pulled my car into a parking area immediately on my right. Larry got out of the car first, then said, "Where did the tennis courts go?" I got out of the car and noticed we were alone. "They were right there," I said. The tennis courts, the players, and everything we were looking at were gone. Instead, there was a building in front of us that was not visible when we pulled in. Strangely, neither of us was afraid, though. We both agreed that we just experienced something very weird. We got back in the car and drove off to play tennis elsewhere. Later, I did some research into the area. I found out there were tennis courts there, but they were torn down in 1954. Did we travel back in time? Did we see ghosts? Larry seems to think we viewed a scene from the 1920s. Also, I have to wonder, did they see us? Next story. We lived in this big house in Scott Township on Swallow Hill Road. We were only the second owners of the house. The original owner was laid out in the living room where he died. There was a graveyard right behind our house, about 50 yards away. If you walked out the back door in a straight line, you would have walked directly on my sister's grave. This house was extremely haunted. Things happened constantly, in the day and night. Everyone was scared to stay in the house by themselves, including my stepfather, who was a police officer. Friends had things happen to them while they were there and would no longer step on the property. I would have to meet them in front of my house, off the property. This house had hardwood floors and a very big kitchen, basement, 2 big fireplaces, and heated floors. At night, we would have all of the chairs pushed in at the kitchen table. Then during the night, almost nightly, you could hear the chairs move and slide around the kitchen floor. Dishes would move around also, from one counter to the next. If you started down the steps, it would stop. You would push all the chairs in, walk upstairs, and it would start all over again. When I would go to sleep sometimes, I would feel a very hard tap on my shoulder, like a finger. If I didn't look, it would just keep tapping my shoulder until I looked. When I looked, no one would be there. Then it would stop, as long as I looked. On another occasion, I had my blankets ripped off and laid out completely flat on the floor. I had this happen many times. When I laid my head on the pillow, I would sometimes hear voices that hurt my eardrum, like someone was flicking it. I couldn't understand the voices. I would have to throw my pillow on the floor and not use it at night when this would happen. I also had my bed shake during the daytime, and only when my brother was present. Stuff would happen daily to everyone who lived there, and people who visited. This was the most haunted house I have ever lived in, and I don't ever want to again. I was scared every day, like I said. It didn't matter if it was night or day. It was constant. There's more I could tell you, but I would have to write a book. So I'll leave you with that. What I feel will give you an understanding of what it means to be haunted. Next story. When I was 7 years of age, my family and myself, at least 40 individuals, took a journey from our homes in Exeter, England, to stay with my father's uncle at his manor house outside of Hamburg in Germany. After 3 days of taking in the sights, we made our way back to the manor house. At this time, after at least half an hour of driving through isolated country roads, we arrived back at around 8:30 at night. Great uncle had promised my cousins and me that we would take a hike through the woods on his vast acreage before we were to turn in for the night. We decided not to venture too far from the main grounds as the night was rolling in quickly and the air became increasingly colder and filled with a light mist. No one could blame us at this time for being weary. We were only children, and all the adults expected our silly little fears to get the best of us. The lads and myself would play jokes on the girls. They always scared the easiest. By 10 at night, our little legs started to give in on us. After 20 minutes of complaining, Great Uncle took us back to his home. With all but the moonlight and the pale specks of light, which we could see from the house, we found it difficult to keep our steps along the slippery dirt path. You see, it had rained before we arrived back from the city. We trudged in through the huge oak doors of the old manor to be greeted by our parents and Nana as well as German swears, as Cook had cut his thumb. It was now most surely time to get to our beds. My parents hurried us up the grand marble staircase to the 3rd floor, where as children were allowed to sleep. I look forward to sharing my room with cousin Chris for the 3rd time now. He was always my favorite cousin. We took our turns to take a quick shower before we went to bed. After the final time that Mom had burst in through the door wailing to us to get to bed, with her watchful eyes still looking on, we slipped into our beds. She bid us good night and left to the balcony, where she was to join my aunts and uncles for wine and German chocolate. As boys will be boys, we defied my mom. We sat by the open window at the far end of our room, where we threw pebbles we'd found in our shoes at the kitchen windows below us. We'd hoped to piss off the cook before bed, but, oh well, we didn't get his attention. But still we sat. We sat and stared across the fields of runner beans and the easterly crops of carrots. The manor had gone quiet, stone cold. As we still looked on, only the sounds of our breathing could be heard across the grounds. The air was an icy cold feeling, but with a pleasant crispness that made it bearable to withhold. With all the lights in the grounds put out, we could only see by the moonlight. Across from the first field opposite our window was an old farm building. We took for granted that the barn wasn't used at all. We never saw Great Uncle or any of the farm hands enter it. Quite dilapidated, the barn stood lonely amongst the beans. After a while, I became bored of staring out of the windows, and I took to bed, leaving Chris alone. I drifted to sleep. Ryan! I was shaken awake by my cousin. He whispered slowly and softly, "Ryan, come to the window. There is something you will not believe." Chris sounded anxious and quite scared. He led me by the arm to our window. Still weary-eyed, my sight was blurred. He pointed out of the window at the old barn, and I followed his directions with blurry vision. I rubbed my eyes open and looked once again towards the old barn. "Can you see it? Can you?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. Through the gentle moonlight we could see a figure standing in one of the windows of the barn. Whoever it was, we could only make out the bold outline in the darkness, but we could see it was a person and appeared to be looking in our direction. We took to hiding behind our tattered drapes. A Gilead reaction indeed. We were pretty freaked. It was like 1 a.m, and some stranger was standing in the old barn. We stepped out from behind the drapes. Chris hid behind me. I gave him a sharp look of annoyance. As we looked onwards towards that window, the figure began to move, quite rapidly. It would stop every so often to look back at us. It seemed quite pissed, and it was pacing backwards and forwards, from side to side in circles and circles. Chris and myself had no clue what to do. We became scared. We slammed our window in confusion. All we could think of doing is getting help. We ran from our room, down those huge marble stairs to great uncle's chamber. We hit hard against his door. He soon stirred to greet us with irritation. He understood little English. I told him there was someone in the old barn. He scratched his head and began to mumble confusing German words. He stormed back inside his room, only to emerge once again with his robe and a flashlight. He then headed for the main door. As he did, we ran back to our rooms to look on. We could see him at least 300 meters to the west of our window. Flashlight in hand, he kept it pointed at the ground. As he moved closer to the old barn, a strange figure stopped in its tracks, only to face us once again, completely motionless. We assumed that Great Uncle had begun to climb a ladder in the raised level of the barn to meet this person. We could see his light becoming brighter as he stepped closer. We could see Great Uncle's head pop up in the background behind the person, but unable to see it as his light was pointed downwards. He stood up as his bright shaft of light passed over the stranger and directly in our line of sight. We squinted our eyes and turned away from the brightness. As we looked out of our window again, the figure was gone, only replaced by the figure of Grand Uncle in his robe, with his flashlight. I turned to Chris, and likewise he looked at me. We were stunned with utter bafflement. We then walked from our rooms down to the main door in confusion, with no doubt of what we had seen. Once meeting Great Uncle, he muttered, "Zir was novan and ziban. Little boys, you should not make up these silly stories. Go to sleep." Next story. The time is 1997, and I had moved to Los Angeles. And while there I had or so I thought, the fortune of working with a paranormal investigator pursuing a lifelong passion. Shortly after working for him, who I shall keep nameless, I became severely disenchanted with the paranormal, since he seemed more focused on somehow connecting with the Hollywood scene, and did not, in my opinion, care much for the scientific aspect of paranormal research. It's hard for me to say whether he ever cared for it, or was, to put it bluntly, a con artist. It was probably one of the most interesting moments in my life, however, and I both loved and loathed it. Regardless of the pseudo-parapsychologist, who among other things stiffed me $600 in back wages for performing administrative duties, the experiences I had on the job were genuine. One in particular comes to mind because I really have not read anything similar to that experience, at least with any frequency. We were investigating an old Los Angeles hotel that had been converted into low-income housing, a place that we had plans to bring tourists to at a later date. While we were there, I believe the fourth floor, by one of the suites, the team encountered a very peculiar phenomenon. Outside the suite there was a patch of space, about waist high, where vision was distorted. We discovered the spot because someone was carrying a magnetometer, and I remember first feeling a funny sensation, like static, and the hairs of my arms began to pick up, not dramatically, but enough to be noticeable. As we all formed a circle around the patch of air, running our hands through it to feel the charge, we were all thrilled to see optical effects. Faint blue auras trailed from our fingertips as we waved our hands through, and soon there were after images of our hands themselves in the air. I hate to use the word because of its drug connotation, but the best way to describe the phenomena was like a psychedelic trip, producing trailing images of one's own hand. Soon the effect was so blurring I had to look away because it was making me dizzy. I was thrilled. A bona fide unexplained phenomena, and here we were, at least 5 individuals experiencing it at the same time. I turned to the parapsychologist, hungering for a theory about what it was we were experiencing, but he was backing away from it, unnerved. I asked him what he thought it was, and he merely shook his head and said he didn't know, and proceeded to back down the hallway. I think that was the point when I started to have my doubts about him. Honestly, it wasn't frightening, but rather fascinating. I had other experiences while working with the team, but after a month I quit. As I said, disenchanted and bitter. I have since moved back to Massachusetts and will still religiously watch Haunted History and other documentaries. And God help me for admitting this, world's scariest places on Halloween. I have not actively gone ghost hunting for a couple of years. My last attempt was an abysmal failure, ended up being harassed and followed by teenage townies. But Once in a while, I'll walk into a building, get that shiver and say, oh yeah, this place has got something going on.